But we, as Christians, when we offer ourselves as sacrifices, we are offering ourselves as living sacrifices. What this means is that it's not a once-for-all sacrifice, like the lamb. You sacrifice it and it's done. This is a continual, day-by-day, progressive sanctification. This is every moment of every day offering your entirety to the Lord as a sacrifice. Every moment of our lives should be one of worship, one of responding rightly to God. Every choice we make, everything we do, every thought we have should be offered to God as a spiritual sacrifice of worship. In this sense, as I said, the entirety of our lives should be worship. Worship is not limited just to Sunday mornings. Congregational worship is a special time that we set apart for God, and we should worship the Lord there, but you can worship the Lord when you're driving. You can worship the Lord when you're shopping. You can worship the Lord when you're reading, when you're listening to music. All of it, all of our lives as Christians is the Lord's. The text says also that our sacrifice must be holy. To be holy means to be set apart. And so we as Christians, as we offer ourselves as sacrifices to God, we need to set ourselves apart for God. A professor of mine in college used this illustration that really stuck with me to explain what this holiness or set apartness looks like. I have a toothbrush in the drawer of my bathroom, and it is what I use to brush my teeth. But my wife also has a toothbrush under the sink of the bathroom that's used to clean the toilet. Now, I can assure you that I never confuse the two. The one toothbrush that's in my drawer is set apart for my mouth, and it touches nothing else. And that toothbrush under the sink is set apart for something a little less clean. And it never touches my mouth, let me assure you. It's the same as for us as Christians. When God says we offer ourselves as holy sacrifices, we are setting ourselves apart for something specific, something unique. We set ourselves apart for God. We offer ourselves as living sacrifices to Him, and we are demonstrating to Him that every part of our lives is set apart for His glory. We are His. This is the kind of sacrifice that God accepts. Paul says here, when you offer yourselves as a living and holy sacrifice, it is acceptable to God. But, let me be clear, our offering of ourselves is not acceptable to God because we are so holy. We're not. There is no one righteous, no, not one, and that includes believers. If you're honest with yourselves, we sin every day, multiple times of the day. It's not as if God accepts our sacrifice because it is so pure. It's not as if He accepts us because we are so holy. Even as Christians, our actions are stained by sin. Even the best things that we do are merely feeble attempts to match up to His holiness. Again, this sacrifice is acceptable to God because of Christ's sacrifice. That is what makes it acceptable. It's not our sacrificing ourselves that makes us acceptable to God. It is Christ's sacrifice by which we are clothed in His righteousness and therefore acceptable to God. In other words, it's not our sacrifice that makes us acceptable. It's the fact that we are acceptable because of Christ's sacrifice that should motivate us to sacrifice. Do you understand the difference? Paul is not saying, sacrifice yourself so that you will be acceptable to God. He is saying, you are acceptable to God because of Christ, and therefore, based on that mercy, based on that grace, based on that gospel, offer yourself up as a living and holy sacrifice. It's always a temptation for us to think that the things that we do are what make us acceptable to God, isn't it? If we just do more right things and think more right things, perhaps God will accept us. It's natural for us to think that way. We tend to think that way, I think, for two reasons. First, because we naturally trust in ourselves and our own work. I mean, I see that in my son. You know, he tries to lift something or do something, and I try to help him, and he says, no, I'm going to do it myself. We're born with that tendency to trust in our own works, to trust in our own effort. But I think we also tend to think this way because this is how it often works with other people. We are more accepted with our friends, we are more accepted with others based on how we act and what we do. Perhaps even with your family. You feel more accepted if you just do better things. But folks, let me be clear. That may be how it works in this world, but that is not how it works with God. You are not more acceptable or less acceptable to God based on what you do if you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, you are already accepted by God because of Christ's sacrifice for you. So all of what we're talking about here, offering up ourselves as living sacrifices and the other commands that we're going to find, let me be clear, none of these things, I'm telling you none of these things so that you will be somehow better in God's eyes. No, these things are not efforts to make us better in God's eyes. These are efforts as a response to God's grace and mercy in our lives. We should want to choose the right kinds of things. We should want to choose the right kind of music, for instance, not because it makes us better, not because it makes us more acceptable to God, but because we are accepted by God. Because we are justified based on Christ's sacrifice, that should make us want to offer ourselves. That should make us want to discern the will of God. That should make us want to make the right kind of decisions in every area of our lives, including our music. Now remember, all of this is moving toward the goal of being able to determine the will of God, being able to discern what is good and acceptable for a Christian. So if you want to be the kind of person who is able to discern God's will about even things like your musical choices, and discern what kind of music is good and what kind of music is acceptable, the way to get there is to completely offer the entirety of your being as a sacrifice to God. That means that you offer up your choices as sacrifices to God. You offer up your preferences as sacrifices to God. You offer up your desires. You offer up everything. As a Christian, there should be nothing in your life that you do not raise as a sacrifice to God. And remember, this is a continual, day-by-day, moment-by-moment sacrificing. It's only when you do this that you will be able to discern God's will, that you will be able to make right choices. So what does this look like then? How practically can we offer ourselves as sacrifices to God? Look at the very first word of verse 2. He says, and. Now that's a key word. Not all translations translate that word. Some of them just start with, do not be conformed. But that little word and tells us that this is connecting the commands in verse 2 with the primary command of verse 1. It's not as if Paul is just giving different, separate commands in verse 2. These commands in verse 2 are connected to the primary command of offering ourselves as living sacrifices to God. In fact, I would suggest that they further explain what it means to offer ourselves as sacrifices. So what does that mean? Paul's using a kind of poetic language, offer yourself as a sacrifice, but what does it mean very practically? Well, in verse 2, he tells us, look again at verse 2. The first command is this, do not be conformed to this world. In other words, don't be worldly. Now, what is worldliness? I remember hearing preaching on worldliness growing up and thinking, what is it? What is worldliness? Well, we certainly had better figure out what it is, not only because we have a command here, don't be conformed to the world, but listen to a couple more commands. I want you to turn to a few passages with me. James chapter 4 first. James chapter 4. We're going to look at a couple passages that talk about the world and worldliness, because I want to emphasize to you, we need to figure out what this means, because there are significant judgments and warnings attached to worldliness. Look at James chapter 4 and verse 4. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility towards God, hatred towards God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. That's significant. If you are a friend of the world, whatever that is, you are an enemy of God. Turn with me to 1 John chapter 2. Just one more passage as we narrow down onto this subject of worldliness. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15. John says, do not love the world. Pretty similar command that we're finding in Romans chapter 12. Neither the things that are in the world. If anyone loves the world, notice this, the love of the Father is not in him. That's serious. If you love the world, whatever that is, then the love of the Father is not in you.